In this podcast, the guys are talking about whatever happened to. And no, we're not talking about the likely lads.
Hello, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast from the Officially Retired Club, or the ORC. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
Right, so today, a slight difference on the podcast. We're not parked in the ORCU, in the counterfactual universe. The train's actually parked up in Real Street, where today we're going to be doing a whatever happened to.
Yep,
so,
just for a change.
So more of a reminiscence this time. So what are we talking about today? Whatever happened to what?
So what we're going to do today, I mean, it's a slight pushing of the boundaries because, strictly speaking, what we're going to talk about still exists, but it's all but gone in the terms of, not usage, but in terms of its promotion and whether people actually want one. The landline telephone.
So it's one of those things where between Ian and myself, we've probably got 70, if not more years, experience in that particular technology. We are officially retired, so that's why it's 70 years between the two of us. No surprise there.
Yep.
But the good old telephone. And when we talk about telephone, we're talking about a device with a cable, which has a handset with a cable and a dial. So your good old, telephone. I don't know any other way of actually describing it these days. It's I'm sure if you speak to a lot of people and say telephone, they think mobile.
Yeah, but do you really mean a telephone with a dial, or do you mean a telephone with a set of buttons? Well,
that's a dial, isn't it?
Well,
all right, it's not a rotary dial.
Correct.
It's got a keypad. You're right. Yeah. I mean, it'd be called a keypad, but a means to dial a number is what. Yeah. One of the. Shall we do a quick history lesson then? Shall we? Quick history lesson about the telephone. So, the telephone was invented in the mid 1870s and accredited to Alexander Graham Bell, although I think there are other claimants, but he just happened to get the patent in first. I think that's...
Well, I'm sure at one point they've sued somebody and made them withdraw their patent. He wasn't a doctor, by the way. Their patent, or he maybe have even stolen somebody's patent. It's all quite... This was in America, of course, so it was, despite the fact he was born in Scotland, but this was in America, so lots of shenanigans as usual going on in that place. But anyway, yeah, so he was the official inventor of the point-to-point telephone, shall we say, a means of speaking to somebody down an electronic wire.
That's right. It's fair to say that if we have any listeners who are 21st century listeners, i.e. born in the 21st century, not the 20th century, the actual concept of a telephone might be a bit alien in that they might only have seen them on the TV. Not that many people, as we know, have a telephone in their house these days. And I don't know your opinion on this. I have a telephone in our house, but it's not that type of telephone. It's a cordless telephone, so it looks like an old mobile telephone. You can pick it up and walk around with it. There's no leads, so you don't think it's got a dial pad, obviously, but the concept of a handset with a wire where you can't walk around with it is probably a bit alien to people who are 25 or below.
When I was a child, and to be fair to my father, who still has it, people would have their telephone in the hall. My father and my parents had a little telephone table where you sat on a little seat, which had a little appendage to it with where the telephone sat. So you literally sat in a different room in the house on a piece of furniture to use the telephone. And I'm not suggesting everybody did that, but it wasn't that uncommon.
We didn't, strangely enough. And I was going to raise it because you're right. Most people had the telephone in the hall, which meant that you could have some sort of semi-private type conversation. And in our house, the telephone was in the front room. Now, it was in the front room because of my mum, but at the end of the day, it was in the front room. So if you ever had a conversation, I remember this girl phoned me once when I was a teenager, and then I'm sitting there while the TV sound has been turned down while I have this conversation, and to say it was embarrassing is an understatement. Mm. But yeah, typically they're in the hall, aren't they? So,
yeah.
Out the way.
And that was the case essentially until the dawning of the mobile telephone, which was in a mass sense was the mid to late 1990s. But to be fair, I mean the actual technology behind the landline telephone had changed through several iterations from a point-to-point private network through switching to other telephones via physical movements of cables.
So just as a further history lesson, right? So the first manual telephone exchange went live in 1878 in New Haven, Connecticut. So that was there was a company called the District Telephone Company of New Haven, and they installed the first manual board. So that's where you see lots of wires and people plugging and unplugging these wires in the sockets.
Yeah.
I am assuming, and I don't actually know this, but in those days, to get the operator's attention, I think you had to press I can't remember what it's called now, the keys, not the keys, the receiver. You'd have to tap that on and off until you heard somebody say, hello, what number do you want? I don't know. It was 1878, so. But you obviously had to get the operator's attention. I don't know whether if you picked the phone up and the receiver's then lifted, a light came on the manual board. Maybe that's how it worked. That's just as
well. And in some cases, I think you had to actually, you visualize some of these old films where you had to wind something or other, a generator on the side of the telephone if it was attached to a wall to generate some current to raise a token or ring a bell at the exchange.
Yeah, that's a bit before our time, so
only just.
So the next stage, which was when people could actually dial a number, where there was an automatic telephone exchange, wasn't that much later in time. So 1892, the automatic telephone exchange, the first one, went live, and that was invented by a guy called Alman Strowger. Now, anybody who works in telecommunications, or certainly on the voice side, Strowger should be a very common term. It was around for decades, Strowger telephone exchanges, but he was the inventor of that particular approach, and I don't know, it's a funny story. Ultimately, he's a funeral director who felt that his competitor's wife, who worked in the manual telephone exchange, was directing business to her husband and away from him, and he wanted to correct that problem and invented an automatic telephone exchange. Just shows you what drives people, or used to drive people. So that's 1896 was the first time, or was originally when the first automatic telephone exchange went in, and that was done by a company called the Automatic Electric Company. History, eh? Anyway, back to you, Ian.
Right. So the thing is about the.
Sorry, I interrupted you and stopped your flow.
The thing about the Strowger is it took a long time to be. We're talking about the UK. It took a long time for that to be integrated into the UK network. They were still replacing manually controlled switchboards well into the early 1970s in rural parts of the UK. So you can see how it
very rural areas.
Well, rural's rural, isn't it? But there wasn't but the interesting thing about the social aspect of the telephone is, as we said, in many cases it sat in a corner of the house. It was the social aspect of the telephone is interesting. So even though the technology was progressing, but there was no great clamour for people to have a telephone. It was expensive. Certainly in the UK, it took ages to arrive, even if you had the money for it to be installed. The post office were a monopoly. It was run by the post office, which is interesting. It wasn't run by a separate agency that may have had plans to encourage its usage. It was run as part of the post office, which is part of the government civil service. So it was very much seen as I wouldn't say a luxury. I wouldn't even describe it as a luxury because people didn't think as something particularly desirable. So even until I have to look at the statistics, but even until the 1970s, many people, for probably at least half the population, didn't have access to a telephone. Hence why you would have public payphones in most shopping centres and outside post offices, etc. So there was no clamour to modernise the telephone. Even before the age for personal use, even before the age of mobile phones, really until the 1980s. In the 1980s, certainly in the UK, there was lots of adverts, and again, bearing in mind that BT was still a monopoly, there was adverts encouraging people to use the telephone. Those of you of a certain age may remember the strange crow character called Busby. It was a cartoon character voiced by Bernard Cribbins. But that was an attempt by the post office and then subsequently BT to encourage the users of the landline. But again, BT had a terrible reputation in the UK for the amount of time it took to deliver a telephone if you didn't have one. Waiting lists up to 6 months. Party lines, whereas not as common in party lines as where you'd shared a line, was not as common as some parts of the US, were not uncommon in the UK because, again, there was lack of capacity. That was physical capacity to actually connect the phone and switch it. So again, the telephone was seen as a device to speak to other people. Obviously, it was deemed to be expensive. People would have little clocks by the telephone, so they didn't run up huge bills, and they wouldn't go out of their way to be ringing people just for trivial conversations. That's not to say people wouldn't just ring up for a chat, but certainly if you were in a family, it wasn't encouraged. The children wouldn't be encouraged to use it. So the telephone was an odd device, really, nothing like what people would consider the modern mobile version of it. You know,
Yeah, absolutely.
But having said that, there was a revolution in the landline sense in the 80s, arguably with the technology becoming cheaper is not quite the right word, but they're certainly more efficient. You could switch more calls around the UK at a cheaper cost than you know, as a network operator, and then competition came into the UK market, and obviously business-wise, the use of the telephone exploded from the late 70s through to the 90s, with call centres becoming common, businesses acquiring, you know, the number of lines per employee needed to go up because employees needed to speak to each other around the UK and abroad. So the telecoms market, or the landline market, because there wasn't really a great deal else in the telecoms business until the late 80s, other than voice as a product. There was other products, but in terms of the mass market of it, the mid to late 80s took off.
Yeah, I mean, from a technology perspective, I mean, Strowger was around certainly in the 80s, was being replaced gradually. Yeah. But in the 70s, it was probably still being installed. So from 1890 up until 1970, that's quite a big. That's quite a lifetime for a manually based.
Well, that's it. But that's
technology, where you're just using magnets and pulses of electricity to drive forward a connection between 2 points in the UK, in the UK, the US. Just in case we do have any listeners not in the UK, Busby's a UK thing, yeah. So there might be an equivalent in the US.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, there was far more competition in the US, certainly between long distance carriers. I couldn't date it, but certainly in the 60s and 70s there was multiple not meaning infinite, but there was a number of US carriers offering long distance calls, and you would choose which long distance carrier you would have. I think to a certain extent your local provider was what it was, but you were able to choose different long distance carriers.
So one of the things that came out of this, and I know is one of your favourite subjects, which is about telephone numbers. And so I was looking this up, and in the US, who there's no doubt from a telecommunications perspective, they always do things first, or it seems to be. So numbering, so the difference between your telephone number and a numbering plan, and maybe Ian can explain a bit more about a numbering plan, was established in the US in 1947, whereas it was 1958 before STD, the equivalent, the subscriber trunk dialing codes, were introduced into the UK. So there was a 11 year gap in that, and that's probably because of the use of the technology by ordinary people. The UK in the 50s, I mean, it's post-war, so still recovering. Even in the early 50s, still recovering, whereas in the US it was a boom time. Phones obviously were cheaper. They needed a way of being able to allow people to dial without, or being able to identify a number for people who are hundreds, thousands of miles away in the US. Not the same in the UK, obviously, smaller country.
Well, and also America's always been more socially mobile. I mean, if you look at the number of automobiles in the US in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it strips the UK by factors of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So people are more mobile. People are more socially mobile. Businesses are more mobile. Business in terms of their coverage. of areas. So business is driving technology in the US. Business was not driving, and even if it was, it would be stymied by the post office. You can have any phone you like as long as it's white or black. Black normally. You can have any type of style of phone as you like, as long as it's the one we give you, which is we've only got one style of phone. So the UK was held back by the government agency controlling the market. So when the government agency controls the market's not going to grow. That wasn't the case in America, So the requirement for subscriber trunk dialing direct is driven by volume. So although it wasn't in the UK, it wasn't growing exponentially, the usage of telephones. It was growing, and they obviously could see it was going to grow much faster than or to larger volumes than they could possibly control with manual switchboards. So by definition, if you do away with manual switchboards, you need a means of dialing from A to B. Just for the benefit of the listeners, I don't really have an interest in telephone numbering, but I got dragged into various applications in the latter years of my career, which involved telephone number allocation and stuff. And boy, did I enjoy it.
You used to talk about it every day.
Oh yes, indeed.
That's what I remember.
But as this is a family podcast, we better not say what I was saying about it. But yeah, so the UK numbering system evolved like all these systems evolved. If you previously with a manual system, you would speak to the operator and tell them the town or the district, and then a number if it was a big enough directorate area. So the classic one which you see on some old films is Scotland Yard. You would speak to the operator and say, "Give me Scotland Yard and Whitehall 1212." So you couldn't dial that number directly. But then as when the Strouger was brought in, and it had to be available obviously everywhere, you could then dial anywhere in the UK. And obviously by that definition, everybody in the UK had to have a unique telephone number. A unique telephone number was derived or given in the way that you would have an area code or an STD code. It's just
so your actual number itself could be non-unique.
Correct. And people got very much used to looking at a telephone number as the full number, but again, that's a result of mobile telephony, because you always have to dial the full telephone number if you're dialing a geographic number. Whereas previously, people wouldn't really consider the area code, the STD code, as part of their number. So it was the norm because of old technology. Dialing a number would frequently be misrouted, i.e. and a wrong number. So either you dialed it wrong, or the digits had been, as you did the dial on your telephone, you turned the rotary dial. Occasionally the numbers would be misconstrued by the exchange, and the exchange would misroute them. So you would get wrong numbers, and people would generally answer the phone by stating their telephone number, which was quite common. So you would say 506433 as you answered the phone, so that people would know they dialed the right number. And I guess some of
that's
our
right. I forgot about
that.
That's an interesting thing that has disappeared in terms of when you answer the phone. People used to say hello and then the phone number.
Yeah,
and that's gone.
That's gone. Yeah, I mean that's gone. I mean,
I wonder when that went. It's strange.
Well, I persuaded my parents to stop doing that about 20 years ago, and they were probably nearly, I wouldn't say they were cutting edge, so they were probably in the mid. So although many of those people unfortunately are no longer with us, or they don't do that anymore. But again, so your number wasn't, you wouldn't think of your number as being unique, but then you wouldn't know of other people having the same number elsewhere. But you wouldn't use the area. You wouldn't say hello 01384506433. You would just use your local.
Well, we always where I grew up, the exchange was Sedgley, so we always used to go hello Sedgley 1 2 3 4 5.
Indeed.
And
but in reality, most people ringing you would be on the same exchange anyway. I mean, you weren't getting phone calls in the 70s and 80s from call centres and double glazing and all the nonsense.
No.
Foreign people pretending to sell you iPhones and all that nonsense. You wouldn't get any of that in those days. So again, it was people known to you. It occasionally might be a tradesperson that you were dealing with or something, but so again, the use of the telephone was very much different. It wasn't a tool. It was it wasn't a tool for somebody to contact you. It was a means to contact your family or to dial the doctor or whoever.
I do remember that one of the things, and fair enough, our phone was in the front room, so it might be a bit different, was that when it did go off, it used to startle everybody. It's because they're not quiet. Those original bell phones, they had one volume, which was loud.
Indeed. So the number would be unique to you within a directorate area. A directorate area would generally be a town or a city, but obviously the bigger cities would have defined 10,000 number blocks for areas. So you would recognise if we're in the Midlands, for example, in Birmingham, which it was 021 became 0121. Certain areas were recognisable. Edgbaston was 45, and then there was a number of digits after that. Which the city centre I think started with 2 or 3. So certain areas would have recognisable number blocks. So, and people got a bit possessive about those. So again, BT were a bit, as it became, or the post office as it became, had issues with numbering because they ran out of numbers that people would recognise, and they would have to apply for new number blocks, and people wouldn't be happy. Well, you've not given me an Edgbaston telephone number. Well, I have, because this is the new Edgbaston telephone number. Yeah, but nobody will recognise that as such, and you can imagine sort of strange conversations. But and some of those strange conversations still go on, would you believe? But not necessarily in BT, but in some other telephone companies that we shan't mention. But people became possessive of their telephone number in the sense of it wasn't the case they would be given other towns' telephone numbers, but they may be given new number blocks that they weren't happy about because that's not the area that I live in. Well, it is now. So it was all quite strange, and it was all quite rigid. That said, the technology behind it became very clever.
I think that's one of the things that I wouldn't say is hidden, but when knowing that how the technology has evolved over the last 30 years, just for the delivery of a telephone call, it's quite fancy in terms of the technological leaps that have been made that moved it forward, ultimately just so that one person can talk to another. That's been outstripped now. And I mean, we will come on to why the telephone doesn't really exist in its current form, because the technology has essentially taken that step forward. And all of the older technology and the older approach in terms of how it used to work has basically gone. And people probably don't make many telephone calls today. They make a voice call, which from our perspective, we would say is different from a telephone call, where you're making a call over an app that allows you to talk to somebody. That's not the same and works in a completely different manner. But the technology, and we won't go into any of the specific details because it's to bore people to tears, and they wouldn't understand half the acronyms that are used in there. But there's been over the years a few generational changes in terms of the technology. So if you equate it to mobile, where we're currently on 5G, so 5th generation, I think they say the fixed telephony or the telephone type network is probably on its 2nd generation. Now, I would argue it's probably more on its 4th, because if you take away Strowger and then you move into the more electric equivalents before you move into your digital type solutions, those were step changes as well. They certainly improved the speed of connection. That was one of the key problems with Strowger, was you could wait a minute for a call to complete, as the rotary connectors used to revolve around and go tick, 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 tick. And if it was got a lot of high numbers in the number, it could take a lot longer. Whereas when they introduced the electronic exchange, you used to go, well, there's a difference as well, because there's something else happened which enabled that, which is the keypad and moving away from the rotary dial. I mean, that's another way of improving the performance of the call connection. And that was one of the key metrics that people wanted to do. But the technology did move forward to produce that. So it's one of those. I'm not sure how that has impacted other areas of technological development in the world, but it probably had some sort of impact, because it was a growing market that was becoming more consumerized with more customers. So therefore there's more investment, and then that technology then gets evolved into other areas. And I'm not talking about telephony or that type of stuff. I'm just talking about the actual technology of the equipment itself. So integrated circuits and circuit boards and miniaturization and that type of stuff. I suspect that telecommunications has had an impact on the wider technological environment in the world.
Yeah, certainly in America, David. I mean, the famous Bell Labs had fingers in virtually every technology pie, but originated in a telephony-driven technology in the in the 50s and 60s, but then ultimately were involved in the development of integrated circuits, all sorts of networks, and improved technology in all sorts of sectors.
But it's probably fair to say that it could be the original technology in terms of the way we look at technology today, gadgets and stuff like that, that this was the original driver.
Well, certainly information technology, which is which drives the internet, World Wide Web. It absolutely is. I mean, there were precursors to the World Wide Web that were totally dependent on voice telephony in terms of any interaction. So there was a system in the UK called Prestel, which was a means of accessing data via telephone that you could query stuff, and that was totally dependent on the analog telephone line that you plugged the console into. Again, this was not a mass market product. It could have been if people had wanted it to be, but they didn't want it to be because A, it was very clunky, B, the information it would tell you was limited, and C, whether it was a cost that anybody would really be interested in. But again, you could see it as a sort of an attempt to get where we are today down a blind alley that didn't go anywhere. But you can see the thought processes. There's this information that people might want to see, and they might want to query it. Well, how did he do that? Well, they've got this telephone line in their home, and ultimately that's what we're doing today. But and certainly in the UK for the next few years, we're still using much of the same physical technology, or the physical access certainly to access that data. Certainly in the local loop, fibre to the home is being rolled out for the whole UK, but it's got a few years to go yet. So we're using.
It's technology. One of those. I know we've spoken about this before, but it's that the one aspect to the delivery of that service for a large part of certainly the UK is how that last mile is delivered, and it's still a cable into your house via a telephone pole, and
or a duct.
I mean, modern, So
in the last 30 years, it's in any new house
right.
Housing development has been ducts, and in a duct being a pipe.
But there's
in the
a
street
lot
that
of
you can put
old
cable
houses.
down.
That's right. Right. So there's a lot of old houses, streets which have still got that. Are they ever going to put ducts? Well, they might do. The fibre stuff.
And in most parts of the world, it's telephone poles anyway, because it's so much cheaper. You haven't got any digging of the streets, and you don't have to necessarily have conversations with every landlord every 50 feet. So it's common abroad.
It's just that it's one of those strange things that's probably something that has been somebody's job for installing, maintaining telephone poles, taking them out for 100 years plus, and that's still going to be here when the actual telephone itself at the other end is long gone. Yeah. And we'll still have telephone poles that need replacing, reinstalling, rewiring, whatever is carried over the wires. It's just a strange one to me that.
I mean, I think we need to caveat this conversation a little bit, saying that although we consider the telephone service still gone, but people potentially will still have a telephone connected to a fixed network provider because they choose to do so. I mean, I
won't use it. That will be the.
Oh, correct. But then it's there as a backup. So I choose to have I've obviously got a mobile phone like everybody else has, but I also choose to have a fixed line access because it gives me access to a different network. Now, I know all the issues about it doesn't work in a power cut and all the rest of it. I'm not suggesting it's I'm on well, it's not a secret. I'm on Vodafone's mobile network, and I have my broadband with BT, who are the two major providers of both services in the UK. I choose to keep a telephony service going with BT because Vodafone's network has, like every other mobile network, has been known to fail. And if it fails, I've got a backup, and vice versa. So, and it doesn't actually cost me much more to have a voice service on BT's broadband service.
But that's partly you having the landline is more of a age thing. I don't say that because
I don't believe so. I disagree.
My kids, neither of them have a landline in their houses.
But then if they were risk averse like I am, maybe they would.
I don't know. I think they would see it as, well, the mobile phone is actually the backup, and if the internet goes down, then we use the mobile phone for using the telephone. Whereas if the internet's there, then we're going to use a different approach.
Yeah, but there are no
for that type of communication. So I want to speak to somebody.
There are no broadband voice applications where you could speak to literally anywhere in the world.
No, but if we're talking about general purpose use, then you know how you contact your friends and family.
Yeah, but how do you contact the fire brigade via your?
Well, no. So then that's a backup using the mobile telephone.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the primary. I agree, but I'm saying it's a backup. So the primary access is my mobile service, and my backup is my voice network via BT.
I don't know. I just think that I think younger people see the mobile telephone as being something for doing things like that, emergency services.
No, I agree. Whatever. I'm not disputing that, and
that's not their primary use of that.
No, 100%. It's not the mobile. I can't even think of the word, to be honest. But the mobile services, the telephony aspect, as we've discussed, is it's not relevant, but it's secondary or tertiary. But I don't think BT as the primary supplier of fixed network telephony in the UK are going to switch off that service anytime. They were offering a VoIP service. I mean, why would they?
No, I agree. And one of the things that holds, and this is another discussion that we've had previously, is what's holding them back from opening this up so that you don't have to use a telephony-based service to get access to things like emergency services or office. Some offices, businesses do allow you to do this.
Oh, you're right.
And
I mean,
you're hamstrung by your phone number. And why should you be stuck because you got to have a phone?
Yeah, but the interesting thing about that. The interesting thing about that is that WhatsApp, which is probably, again, do the statistics out there, but WhatsApp, which is probably the primary messaging system other than direct messaging within the network itself, but does require a telephone number. I don't know why they choose to go down that route. If that was a technology-driven requirement, I mean, Skype doesn't require a telephone number, and iMessage or FaceTime, the Apple equivalents, they don't require a telephone number. WhatsApp do. Again, if somebody knows,
Google Meet doesn't. There's lots of these messaging apps, and when they say messaging, all right, so a lot of people do text rather than talking. That's a different It's a different type of conversation about why people don't speak to each other these days. But they do all offer voice and video as a means of connecting people together and allowing them to communicate. What you can't do is you can't have somebody who's on Skype talking to somebody who's on WhatsApp.
No, exactly, and that's the odd thing about it. But I mean, we're digressing a bit here. If you go back,
that's more about the future.
The landline. I think it'd be worthwhile just very briefly explaining what the usage of it. I agree. I don't use my landline, but it's there if I need it.
But when you go to VoIP, I know I'm taking a step back here. So when you go back to VoIP, as is the evolution of all landlines.
But that's what I was going to say. We need to explain for the benefit of what that means. So previously, essentially, this is a gross exaggeration, but until the advent of VoIP, you had a physical connection. If you dialed your uncle in Aberystwyth from wherever, you had a physical connection using dedicated capability and capacity through a dedicated network to your uncle forever. So you dialed the telephone number. It was analysed as, you're dialing somebody in Aberystwyth. It was switched through to Aberystwyth. It rang the phone at the other end, and when you spoke to him, you spoke on a physical connection all the way there, and you were not competing with anything else for that voice capacity. Now that's a gross exaggeration. It's not even necessarily true, but for the sake of argument and do our comparison of VoIP, that's how it worked. So to a certain extent, you were competing, but you were competing with other voice services, but you weren't competing against. When you use VoIPs, essentially you have no connection to anything. You have a connection to the broadband via the broadband service. Your voice is just another application, the same way that Netflix is or WhatsApp, and your voice telephony is packetized, or your voice call is packetized. What I'm saying now is being packets into small packets of information, and it's sent on to through the internet or through the through the not a non-dedicated network. So you're competing with all the other traffic on the network. Now you can prioritize voice if your broadband or your network provider chooses to do so, you can give it some priority so that it doesn't get lost, because obviously voice has a real-time aspect to it. There's no point in the parts of it arriving all in the wrong order, or it being delayed and all the rest of it, although sometimes that does happen. But you're competing against pictures of Taylor Swift and videos of who knows what, and Spotify and Netflix, and it's just lost in the ether, but it does get there, and it's decoded at the end in real time, and you can hear people speaking. So that's the difference. You do not have a dedicated. So that's obviously cheaper from a network perspective.
There is another thing that, in terms of the difference between the two, and this is coming back to your backup scenario, which is the old approach of non-VoIP, so an analog or a direct connection to the telephone network, is that the wiring from your phone to the telephone network is dedicated. And when you pick the phone up, one of the things we didn't talk about, because this is something not many people listen to these days, which is dial tone. It's probably not even a term younger people would even recognise as something.
Well, frequently people get dial tone and ringtone mixed up, and they don't even know what the
that's
the
right.
difference is. Yeah.
So when you pick a phone up and you get dial tone, that dial tone is coming from. So in the old world, the dial tone is coming from the telephone exchange, which means that the power to give you that dial tone is coming from the telephone exchange. Now with VoIP, you will still get dial tone, because that's how making a telephone call works, but the dial tone is actually produced by the box that your phone is plugged into. Now, if you lose power at home, then you won't get any dial tone because your box won't have any power. Whereas if you lose power at home and you've got an analog connection, it still works. And that is one of the other key differences between the old approach and the old world and the new world, is that power is local, whereas in the old world it wasn't. So you still had connectivity you could still make a 999 call if your electricity had gone off. You won't be able to do that unless you've got some battery backup. There's all sorts of malarkey to make it happen, but it isn't as straightforward. So that's just a different, another difference.
Yeah. I mean, but the purpose of dial tone was just to give the customer confidence that the actual telephone was working. Because previously it would have been an operator going hello. Now you had dial tone saying yes, you have an ability to dial.
Yeah, you're connected to the telephone exchange.
I mean, the obvious point being is, like everything in technology, resources were scaled to likely usage. So in the event that a small town had some meteorite explode 50 miles away and everybody saw it and everybody picked up the phone to ring somebody, only 10% of the people picking up the phone would have got dial tone, because you do not resource equipment to give dial tone to everybody picking up the phone. And that was true of so although we had a dedicated network, it was resourced for likely usage. Hence why there was programs or adverts, going back to the Busby and the It's Good to Talk and all the rest of it, to encourage people to use the telephone after 6 o'clock, because businesses had stopped using it during the day, freeing up capacity. So, the two aspects: A, the capacity was sitting there doing nothing because everybody had gone home from their office, and B, you were more likely to get through because you weren't competing against all the businesses dialing each other. So there was always
BT wanted to make more money, of course. So.
Oh, correct. So there was the social aspect as well. Use your telephone more, but it was use your telephone more after 6 o'clock because it's not doing it. The network is quiet then. You're not going to.
But you say that, but I mean, and this comes down to investment, I suppose. But the US model is different, whereas local calls were free, always have been. So you could do that in the daytime or at the night time.
Yeah.
But it did encourage people to use the phone. I suppose that's one of the things.
But then they were generally a generation ahead in switching technology. They had digital exchanges before the UK did. They had itemized billing before the UK did. So again, their capacity to switch calls was probably 10 years ahead of the UK. So there was less of an issue of, well, everybody can't be ringing everybody out at the same time because it won't get through. So it was managing the expectation. So again, with VoIP, which still, with VoIP, there isn't that issue. You may not get through because the internet is too busy, but that is unlikely because it's not infinite, but the capacity is much bigger because you're not dedicating it to a service. As soon as you dedicate a service to a fixed capacity, think of the motorways, that capacity fills up and you haven't got any extra capacity. Whereas if you've got a huge tunnel and everything's going down the huge tunnel, yes, you might have some problems, but in reality, that's less likely than having a huge tunnel with a small cable, which you're trying to go down. So the technology has moved in many ways, but yeah, the landline has changed. And it isn't what it is. It's gone. People don't use it, but it's there as an alternative. And somebody somewhere will sell you the service because people might want it as an alternative. They might want it as a means of controlling what comes in and out of the house. Who knows? But it certainly has moved a long way from where it was. And I couldn't even tell you the last time I made an outgoing call. Well, I can't tell you the last time I made an outgoing. When the Vodafone network locally failed a year or two ago, and it was down for 4 or 5 hours, and I don't get a great signal at the best of times. Whatever the issue was, it wasn't working over Wi-Fi, but my landline was still working. So, and there wasn't a power cut. So it wasn't just the power cut scenario, which doesn't work on VoIP, but it was an alternative. And you could argue, well, you could have some spare SIM cards. Well, fine, people might do that as well on a different operator, but it just gives you that second.
I still think that it'll be missed. The landline, it's served its purpose. We've moved. You can see the direction that it's moving to, and I'm not talking about VoIP, I'm talking about messaging apps and the more social network, well, not social networking, but the app approach to voice moving away from telephony.
Yeah, because
there is a difference between the two.
No, indeed, because the mechanism of making a call over WhatsApp or FaceTime or Skype or whatever isn't actually switching. It's not switching the call from A to B. It's basically broadcasting the call to a server. It says, "Oh, I know this person. He's over there," and then it routes the call.
That's right. So
there is no digit analysis. There is no. This is Aberystwyth calling London. Oh, that's 01 something other or 02.
So everybody's connected. This is it isn't like this, but this is a way of looking at it. Everybody has access to one central server. And you say you want to connect to this other person who's also connected to that server, and it connects you. And it's one box in the middle, and everybody's on the outside.
Indeed.
The telephone network is completely different from that.
Yeah. So, and then the thing to illustrate that from a physical sense is that most towns in the UK had a telephone exchange. Now, if you're a big town or a city, you'd have multiple telephone exchanges, but certainly most towns would have a telephone exchange. You might have what was known as a concentrator, but let's just call it a telephone exchange. And those digital exchanges, which were rolled out in the 80s, were approximately the size of a tennis court. So most towns had something the size of a tennis court, switching calls locally or nationally or internationally. They've gone, or are very soon to have gone. So in the UK, there was approximately BT had 800 to 900. Other carriers in the UK, you can add another 200 or 300 to that. So let's call it 1,500 television exchanges the size of tennis courts. They've been replaced by things the size of your laptop, but there aren't 1,500 of them anymore. And we won't talk about how many are because it's for scary. There are more than one. There's more than two, but there, strictly speaking, doesn't need to be. But there are in the low dozens, the high dozens, purely for security. So there's different buildings have different soft switches as known as. But you think of 1,500 tennis court sized machines being replaced with 50 laptop sized machines in the space of 30 years. And if you don't find that amazing, you're listening to the wrong podcast.
Well, hopefully not. Hopefully they're enjoying this podcast.
What's wrong with you? Do you think of 1,500 tennis courts replaced with a small cupboard full of laptops? Now it's not like that because as I said, there's physical security issues, but that's the technology size.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's just the advancement of technology these days, isn't it? So it's one of those things where I know it served us well over our careers. We had some good times and some bad times.
It's not a song. It sounds sick now. It's
it's gone, but not. It hasn't gone, but it's going. But it's not forgotten. But it shouldn't be forgotten. It was an important part of the 20th century.
Yes, and as
ultimately, the 21st century really hammered a nail in its coffin.
Yeah, and the telephone companies that supplied or are supplying broadband, which do everything, they were driven by changes in voice usage, voice technology, all that. Arguably, I'm not suggesting the internet or whatever wouldn't have happened without it, but the way that those companies just took that product. So broadband was rolled out, certainly UK, again in a mass market sense in the early 2000s. Those were all done by the major telephone companies those major telecom companies had developed their means of delivery and the means of service through the voice telephony system by deploying technology to support voice in the 80s and 90s, to deploying sales techniques to encourage the usage of it. That broadband usage that everybody takes for granted now was rolled out on the back of the 80s and 90s rollout of voice. You know?
Oh yeah. No, it's a good reuse of infrastructure, because it would have cost a hell of a lot more to have replaced it with something new. As the fibre rollout is turning out to be.
Yeah, and imagine if you know, it's sort of an alternative universe way of looking at it. But imagine if it was decided that the use of broadband would be controlled and rolled out by the people who run the railways, or the people who collect your refuse, the councils. But there's you can argue there's a logic to why telephone companies rolling out, but it's not necessarily. I'm sure some countries, almost certainly, given the broadband fibre optic rollout to some random government agency which had no background in previous technology deployment. But so the broadband success. And it's an amazing success that everybody's got access to a high speed fibre in their house, or even over the mobile network. All that technology, because even mobile networks use switching technology.
So that's probably for another discussion in terms of mobile.
Yeah. As
we are coming to the end of our time on this podcast, if anybody is listening and they have any questions,
I hope they are.
It would be nice to get some feedback on any thoughts or conversations they'd like us to talk about. The future. We do know what we're talking about, although we've waffled a lot.
It's good to talk. Yeah. Is the landline definitely dead? Is it an alternative? The landline. What is a landline? Is telephony via broadband? I guess what is the future of telephony via broadband as opposed to mobile over the radio spectrum.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to do that as a different podcast. Yeah. But we'd really like to get some feedback on this one. Well, I know all of our podcasts.
So you can find us in Twitter. So our Twitter handle, our Twitter username is ORC_ I've forgotten.
Time.
ORC_time. ORC_time. Search us out on Twitter. Like us, dislike us, give us some feedback. I'm the moderator. If I don't like what I say, I'll take it out. But
don't forget to follow us so that you get notified of any new episodes.
Yeah,
it's worth saying. And we'll look forward to next hearing, or we'll look forward to, or hopefully you'll look forward to the next podcast from the ORC. So thanks everybody. See you soon.
Bye.
That's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends.